Thereafter, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said about menstruation, هذا شيء كتبه الله على بنات آدم. This is a matter, yani this is something that Allah ordained upon the daughters of Adam. That's narrated by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. And what appears from this hadith is that, who knows, who would be not included there if this is a matter ordained for the daughters of Adam? Yeah, Eve, yani, yeah, not the sons of Adam. For sure not the sons, but Eve, because she's not the daughter of Adam, alayhi salatu wasalam. Yeah, the meaning of the question was, which, any woman, the scholars, they said that. They said that this hadith, they commented on that, it doesn't appear to include Eve. The chapter of menstruation, postpartum bleeding, and defective bleeding is among the important chapters that one ought to pay special attention to learning. Due to the prevailing hardship resulting from it, and due to the many religious rules that are attached to it, the prevailing hardship resulting from it, yani, this is very detailed chapter, a very detailed subject. So requires that one would pay special attention to it, would learn it in a good way, so to understand its cases. And due to the many religious rules that are attached to it, such as purification, prayers, fasting, and pilgrimage, as well as other matters like divorce and iddah and sexual intercourse. This is why it is obligatory to learn some of the judgments of menstruation, so that one would be conforming to what Allah the Exalted revealed. Surely, some women's ignorance of these rules led them to abandon the prayer at times when the prayer is obligatory. This is a great danger that is not cured by anything but knowledge. Allah the Exalted said, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْمَحِيضِ قُلْ هُوَ أَذًى فاعتزلوا النساء في المحيض ولا تقربوهن حتى يطهرن فإذا تطهرن فأتوهن من حيث أمركم الله. They ask you about menstruation, O Muhammad. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْمَحِيضِ قُلْ هُوَ أَذًى. Say it is excrement. Say it is adha, it is excrement, the menses. فَاعْتَزِلُوا النِّسَاءَ فِي الْمَحِيضِ. So refrain from sexual intercourse with the women during menstruation. Do not approach them until they are pure. This means here, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوهُنَّ حَتَّى يَطْهُرْنَ. This part of the ayah means don't approach them as long as they are actively menstruating. Don't approach them until their menstruation stops. That's the meaning of yatuhurn. Their menses stops. فَإِذَا تَطَهَّرْنَ. Then when they have performed purification, when they did the ghusl, so that's two different things. Don't approach them until they are pure means don't approach them while they're menstruating. Don't approach them until the menses stops. Then when they have performed the ghusl, فَإِذَا تَطَهَّرْنَ فَأْتُوهُنَّ مِنْ حَيْثُ أَمَرَكُمُ اللَّهُ. Then approach them in whatever way Allah has made lawful. That means that you can be with them in any position that's not haram. Question, does excrement mean harmful? Not exactly, but adha means more than harmful. The adha means like, it can mean like what comes out of your nose or what's in your ears or the urine or the feces. All that is adha. Whoever does not know the difference between menstruation and defective bleeding, or does not know how to perform purification from menses, is not safe from opposing the law of Allah. How do you tell the difference between menses and defective bleeding? Meaning, whoever doesn't know, any woman who doesn't know that this blood that she's experiencing is no longer menses, but now it's defective bleeding. Or it's not defective bleeding, it's menses. If she can't tell the difference between those, or if she doesn't know how to perform purification from menses, then she's not safe from opposing the law of Allah. The female companions used to ask the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about matters they encountered but had no knowledge of their judgments, and he used to answer them. This indicates the special care that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam provided to clarify these judgments, and the special care that these female companions gave by asking about them, meaning they didn't let their bashfulness, their shyness, prevent them from asking. I knew a sister who she needed questions for menses answered, but she's too shy to ask. And her shyness is so strong, even without someone knowing whose blood is that in the image, she doesn't want to show it to anybody. So can't be like that. These are pages composed to tackle this subject. It has clarification of some of the rules of menstruation, postpartum bleeding, and defective bleeding. Some means very important and immediate rules and relevant ones. And what is related to them? Like, what's haram to do when menstruating? Allah is the one besought to make it beneficial. Al-Hayd, menstruation. Menstruation is a naturally occurring bleeding that exits the woman's vagina in a healthy manner without being due to childbirth. Damu jibillah. That means it's normal. It's natural. That's how Allah created the women. It exits from the woman's vagina in a healthy manner. Yani, that bleeding is a healthy bleeding. It's not bleeding that's defective, without being due to childbirth. The earliest age at which a woman menstruates is approximately 9 lunar years. Approximately 9 lunar years. Hence, if she sees blood before reaching 9 years, then if that were by a time that does not accommodate both a cycle of menstruation with a cycle of purity, she sees the blood before reaching 9 years by less than 16 days, then it is menstruation, or else it is defective bleeding. So what that means is, if you want to give a very general statement that's not the most exact statement, but it's passable, you could say the earliest age at which a woman menstruates is 9 lunar years. And if you wanted to give a more exact statement, you could say the earliest age at which a woman menstruates is approximately 9 lunar years. What's the benefit of adding approximately there? To give her a little bit of room before she becomes 9. How much room does she have to bleed, to have vaginal bleeding before being 9 years old, and that vaginal bleeding is menses? What's that approximate? Because approximate means close. Here, if she sees the blood before reaching 9 lunar years by less than 16 days, so means she's not 9 years old yet, but she'll be 9 in 15 days, or 14 days, or 13 days, for example. Less than 16 days, then this is menses. That's the meaning of approximately. seeing the blood by less than 16 days before becoming 9 lunar years. That's about 8.5 years old. 9 lunar years is approximately 8.5 years old, or 8 years and a half, which is what, as we see here, a time that does not accommodate both a cycle of menstruation and a cycle of purity. So what that means is, as we're going to see, the minimum of menses is 24 hours. That's 1 day. And the minimum of purity from menses is 15 days. So what's the total of 1 plus 15? 16. So if a female saw vaginal blood 16 days before she becomes 9, if then it would be, that's enough time, then that's enough time that could fit a whole menses and a purity. 16 days is enough time to fit a menstrual cycle and a purity cycle. So if that were valid for her, then means she can menstruate before she's 9. We're saying here she can't menstruate before she's 9. It's not valid. It's not menses. But she might experience menses shortly before she becomes 9. How shortly? By enough time that it couldn't have been a menses and a purity before she becomes 9. It has to be before she becomes 9 in order for that to be menses, a time that can't be enough for an entire menses and an entire purity. So then that's menses. Is that clear? Any question there? You said you didn't get that. Yes. Yani. So is it clear for you that the minimum of menses is 24 hours? Okay. And it's clear for you then that the minimum of purity from menses is 15 days. That's a total of 16 days. So, is it valid for a female to bleed before she becomes 9, and then for that to stop, and then to be clear for 15 days, and then she becomes 9, and then she bleeds, and then she becomes clear after that? No, it's not. It's not valid. That's not menses. When we say the earliest age at which a female, the earliest age, yeah, but no, you need to answer the question the way I'm asking you so that you understand the case. Is it valid that the woman would, before she's 9, she has a bleeding that's valid to be menses, like 24 hours of bleeding, and then that, and then she's clear for 15 days, and then at 9 she will bleed a second time, a new one like the first one? That's the meaning of my question. And then when she becomes 9, no, it's not valid. So that's because that would mean she menstruated before she was 9, completely menstruated and had a purity from there, and then menstruated again when she became 9. So since that's not valid, then the earliest that she could possibly menstruate is a time before becoming 9 that's less than 16 days. Amin wa fikum. So what we're saying here is, assuming that she menstruated on the day of her 9th birthday, if we were to assume that this girl menstruated for the first time, or she menstruated the day of her ninth lunar year, then if she did menstruate the day of her ninth lunar year, it's not possible that she menstruated before that. It's not possible. It is possible, though, that she would menstruate shortly before she becomes 9 lunar years. Then she might menstruate again after that, a little bit after she became 9 lunar years. Not the day she became, though. So I think that's clear then, inshallah. The author says, the shades of menstrual blood. The colors of menstrual blood are 5. Yani, there are 5 colors for menstrual blood. Black, red, pink, yellow, and murky. So, the colors of menstrual blood are 5. What is meant by aswad, black, is the red that is so deep that it leans towards blackness. So it's not pure blackness. For that is not considered menstruation. Yani, if something that was purely black came out, that's not menses. Needs to be blood, but it's going to be very dark. What is meant by ashqar is the bright or brilliant red, meaning the pink. The akdar, murky, is that which its color is close to the color of soil. Or it's like the blood that is rinsed from meat. Now, if you have some meat and then blood comes out of it, out of your halal meat. So this blood that looks like the color of soil, or looks like the blood that comes out of meat, that's one of the colors of menses. One might say brown. And all of these have shades too. So there's 5, but there's shades in between them. Furthermore, the blood that has black streaks is judged as black, and likewise, what has red streaks is judged as red, and so on. What that means is, these colors here in the order that they are presented are from strongest to weakest. So black blood is stronger than red is stronger than pink, etc. But what if a woman had, let's say, it's pretty much red blood, but there's a streak of black in there, or even a dot? Or it's pink blood, but there's a streak of red in there. Then you judge all of that blood by that one streak, which is the stronger one. If it were red blood with a streak of black, then judge it as black blood. If it were pink blood with a streak of red, then judge it as red blood. And so on. The reason why this is relevant is because sometimes the way you're going to tell the difference between menstrual blood and defective bleeding is by the strength of the blood. The rule is, as we're going to say, menstrual blood is stronger than defective blood if you can tell the difference between them, if they don't come out the same way. If they don't come out the same way, and one of them is menses and one of them is defective, then the stronger one is the menses. So if you have red blood and it has a streak of black in it, you're going to judge it as black. That's relevant, that's important, so that you know how to tell the difference between menses and other blood. You said, what is stronger takes precedence in order to judge it as that type of bleeding? If it were 2 types of bleeding seen, the question's not really clear for me. Let me say it like this, which is what I just said. The reason we need to know these colors, and even how to judge the blood if it has more than one color in it, because we're talking right now about in one sitting, let's say a woman checked herself and she put some tissue or some cotton so she could check the status of her blood. So when she withdrew that tissue or cotton, she found it red, but it has black in it. So this is one bleeding we're talking about here, not two different bleedings. We're not comparing two different bleedings here. In one bleeding, when she pulled that tissue or cotton, she found it red with a streak of black. So then which judgment, Yani, what color is she going to judge all of that blood? What's the answer? Black. This is without comparing this bleeding to a different bleeding. Without comparing this bleeding to a different bleeding. We're talking about one bleeding that has two colors in it. Then the color of this one bleeding is going to be the stronger color. The yellowish and murky colors, these two have some talk about them, so they have their own section here. The weighty opinion is that the yellowish and murky colors that appear during the days that are possibly menstruation are considered menstruation. These are important words here. Days that are possibly menstruation. I'm going to bold that. Days that are possibly menstruation. That's such an important word. So keep that in mind. Because in so many cases, we're going to say, if it's possible that that's menses, Yani, what's the rule? The rule is whatever is possibly menses is menses. Whatever is possibly menses is menses. We already just took a case that's not possibly menses. A girl before the day of her 9th lunar year saw bleeding 16 days before that birthday. That's not possibly menses. It's not possibly menses. So the rule is whatever is possibly menses is judged as menses. Thus, if a woman sees any of that, the yellow or the murky, she considers it menstruation according to the weighty opinion because they belong to the colors of menstruation. Some Shafi'i scholars said that if she sees any of that after the days of her menstrual habit, then she does not consider it menstruation. What's that detail there? After her habit. Hence, if her menstrual habit is 7 days, for example, and after these 7, she sees a yellowish or murky fluid, she does not consider it menstruation. So that's the second saying. So one saying, which is the weighty saying, is yellow and murky are menses if those are days that are possibly menses. The second saying here is yellow and murky are not menses if it came after her habit is done. Her own personal norm. After her own personal norm is done, then she saw yellow or murky color, blood, or yellow or murky color, fluid. Then, according to this saying, it's not menses. So there you have a detail, might help you if you need it. You said, so when it says possible menses, does that mean within the 15 days? Not merely within the 15 days. Yes, but it means something even broader than that. Meaning, let's say one day a woman saw bleeding and for some reason she was confused about her case. So then she asked, and then under some questioning and some investigation, it became clear that it's possible that this is a day of menses. So since it's possible to be menses, then the judgment is that it is menses. Or let me say it in another way. When it says it's possible menses, That excludes the days that are not possibly menses, like if she's before 9 lunar years, approximately. So then those days are not possibly menses. Or like, for example, she had 15 days of menses and then her bleeding stopped. Now she needs to get 15 days of purity, right? Yes. But then she saw blood before a complete 15 days of purity. So is it possibly menses? It's not possibly menses. So according to what I'm telling you now, that's why the strong saying is that a pregnant woman could menstruate. Why? Because it's possibly menses. So any bleeding that's possibly menses is judged as menses. Okay, so if you need to follow up with that, go ahead, please. The minimum, maximum, and average durations of menstruation. The minimum duration of menstruation is a day and a night, which means 24 hours. 24 hours, a day and a night. But here, you need to know that doesn't mean 24 consecutive hours. Yani, I'm going to say ahead of time here, before the author says, and then it's going to come back around. The minimum of menses is 24 hours of bleeding inside of 15 days. 24 hours of bleeding inside of 15 days. So when you see it said here, the minimum duration of menstruation is a day and a night, you might imagine that that means 24 consecutive hours, or else it's not menses. And that's not the intended meaning here. 24 hours inside of 15 days. That means the bleeding could break up. Inside those 15 days, come on and off, on and off. So once the bleeding starts, she starts counting the hours first. She doesn't count days yet. She counts the hours first because she needs to get to the 24 hours to even consider it menses. Once she sees bleeding, she starts counting the hours. Inside of 15 days, though. Once she gets to 24 hours, then she's going to calculate how many days that's been. Because then she's going to know all those days were menses. All of those days were menses. Not part of those days were menses. If she's bleeding on and off inside of 15 days, and then the total of all that bleeding became 24 hours, she will then know that all of those days were menses. Wasn't part of the day was menses and part of it wasn't. So the minimum duration of menstruation is a day and a night. Hence, if a woman sees blood, even if she's pregnant, because it's possible to be menses, at a time which is valid to be menstruation, same thing, valid to be menses means possible to be menses, then she judges it as menstruation, even before it reaches 24 hours. That's the rule. She doesn't wait for it to be 24 hours to implement the rules of a menstruating woman. As soon as she starts bleeding at a time that's possibly menses, she will immediately start implementing the rules of a menstruating woman. She will refrain from prayer and fasting and intercourse with her husband, etc. If the blood stops before 24 hours, she does not need to perform a ghusl for it because it did not reach the minimum menstruation. This sentence here, if the blood stops before 24 hours, she does not need to perform a ghusl for it. So, if it doesn't come back, if it stopped, it never came back, then khalas. It didn't reach menses. Rather, she performs wudu and prays, meaning she makes istinja from the blood that she experienced. And she doesn't have to do a ghusl because it wasn't 24 hours of bleeding. and then she prays. Then, if the blood returns and flows, she considers it menstruation and leaves out praying. And she does that back and forth, back and forth. When the bleeding starts, she acts like a menstruating woman, even if it didn't reach 24 hours. If it stopped before reaching 24 hours, she doesn't act like a menstruating woman, or she doesn't act like a woman who was menstruating. She merely makes istinja and wudu and she prays. But if it comes back, then she acts like a menstruating woman. And if it goes away before 24 hours of bleeding, then she does not act as if she was a menstruating woman. That's how it goes. If the bleeding comes in a time that's possibly menses, she acts like a menstruating woman, even though it didn't reach 24 hours. If the bleeding stops before the 24 hours, then she acts like she was not a menstruating woman, and she doesn't have to take a ghusl. If the bleeding comes back, then she acts like a menstruating woman, even if it didn't reach 24 hours. If the bleeding stopped, then she does not act like she was a menstruating woman. If it adds up to 24 hours, yani, let's not say if. When it adds up to 24 hours, even if by adding it to the previous bleedings, then it stops, then she performs a ghusl and she prays. And even if that keeps happening inside the 15 days. Meaning, once she got to the 24 hours of bleeding and then it stopped. So what's she going to do? Take a ghusl. But she's still inside her 15 days and then it comes back. So that means this is possibly menses. So then she acts like a menstruating woman. Then it stops. She takes a ghusl because she doesn't know it's going to come back. But she's still inside her 15 days and then it comes back. That means this is still possibly menses. Or this is possibly menses. And like that. The average menstruation is 6 or 7 days. Its maximum is 15 days. Therefore, the blood that flowed during the 15 days would be considered menstruation. And the clean time in between is menses. It's not that part of her day was menses and part of it wasn't, when that bleeding is coming on and off, like we already said. And the praying that she did in between bleedings, she knows that that's not valid. When the bleeding comes back and she knows really she's still menstruating, then she knows whatever praying and fasting she did in between wasn't valid because she's still menstruating. The cessation of blood can be known by the woman inserting cotton inside her vagina and it comes out white, or by the secretion of the white discharge. Yani, how does she know the bleeding stopped? Like we just said now. Also, very good question. How does she track the time? Very easy. By merely seeing that blood, that's when she starts counting. By merely seeing that the bleeding stopped, that's when she stops counting. That's it. She doesn't have to track it more exactly than that. It means she doesn't have to look every half hour, every quarter of an hour. No. Like, let's say a woman woke up at Fajr time to find herself menstruating. Let's say she woke up 5 a.m. to find herself menstruating. Does it mean that she started menstruating right there from the moment she opened her eyes? No. So when does she start counting? She starts counting from the time she saw it. That's it. Easy. Same thing. Let's say a woman woke up to find that her menses is done. So does it mean that it just stopped as soon as she opened her eyes? Khalas? No, not necessarily. So then how does she count when it stopped? Just by merely what she saw. When she opened her eyes and she looked, like she went to the bathroom and then she looked and saw that, then at that time when she saw that there's no blood, that's when she counts that it stopped. That's how she counts her hours and her days. Postpartum bleeding. You said sometimes the blood isn't there, but after an hour it comes back. So that's what we covered now. So that means the blood stopped. So she's not going to count that. She's going to say it stopped. So then if it comes back after an hour, she's going to say it started again. She's going to start counting again. So that's how she counts her hours. Starts for some time, meaning that's when she saw it. And then it stops, meaning that's when she saw that it wasn't bleeding anymore. And then it came back again. Maybe it came back 2 hours ago, but she didn't know. Those 2 hours, she doesn't have to worry about that. And then she looked, and then she found it came back again. So at that moment, that's when she's going to start counting again. You say, so she should pray when it stops that first time she sees. She doesn't have to pray immediately, but she has to not let the prayer time go out without praying. So if she suspects that the blood's going to come back and she says, let me just wait a little bit, she can. And then maybe it'll come back. Or she might wait and then she sees, okay, the time's getting tight now. Let's see if the blood came back. And then she sees it didn't come back. So what she's going to do? She's going to pray before the time goes out. That's a good question. Barakallahu fikum. The postpartum bleeding is the blood that exits after the womb is emptied from the pregnancy. Even if it were coagulated blood or some flesh that the midwives judge as the origin of a human. Yani, a woman was pregnant and then her womb was vacated. Whether what came out was a healthy baby or even stillborn or even a blood clot or a flesh clump. If the midwives said that this blood clot or this flesh clump is the origin of a human, and then after that came out, she experienced vaginal bleeding. So what's that vaginal bleeding? That's postpartum bleeding. Likewise, the blood that exits with the child or during contractions before the child is born is not considered not considered postpartum bleeding. Nor is it menstruation. Rather, it is defective bleeding. So the woman prays despite the blood flow. She prays despite the blood flow. How's that? Because you learned in the summary of obligatory knowledge that there's something called dawamul hadath, a lasting impurity, an ongoing impurity. So does the lasting impurity stop a woman from praying? Like if she had incontinence of urine? No. Also, if she had istihada, sickness, bleeding, doesn't she still have to pray? Yes. So if she has to pray with this bleeding, then so be it. The minimum of postpartum bleeding is a moment, meaning any blood that exists, any blood that is present is postpartum. We talk about after delivery or after the womb is vacated. The maximum is 60 days. That's 2 months. And the average is 40 days, a month and 10 days. You said, do we still judge that as it was a cut? No, because this is not a cut. If you have a cut, that's not an impurity. We talk about impurity, we're talking about here that you can't pray. So, for example, as a man, if you got, your arm got a gash in it, for example, and it's bleeding, you're not going to say, I'm impure now, because that's not an impurity that would break your wudu. But here we're talking about a vaginal bleeding. So we know that when something comes out of the private part, it's going to break the wudu. So here we have a woman that there's blood coming out of her vagina. That's different from having a cut. She has blood coming from her vagina. So that's why there's an issue of if she has to pray or not, or can she pray or not? Is she pure or not? Do you still have to perform ghusl after istihadah finishes? No, you don't. For istihadah, all you have to do is make istinja. Purity. Now, this is also very important here. When you learn about the rules of menses, if you want to be good at the rules of menses, remember that a woman's habit is not merely the number of days that she usually menstruates, the number of days she usually bleeds. A woman's habit includes the days that she normally bleeds and the days she's normally pure. Both of those together, that's her norm. So it's important to track the purity too. Track the menses and track the purity too. Because while, let's say, one woman, her norm, let's say, is to menstruate for 7 days and then to be pure for 23 days. Okay, so she should say her norm is to bleed 7 days out of the month, or 7 days, and to be pure for 23 days. But another woman, her norm might be to menstruate for 2 days and then to be pure for 3 months, and then to menstruate for 2 days and then to be pure for 3 months, and then to menstruate for 2 days and then to be pure for 3 months. So that's her norm. You have to, in order to determine her norm, you have to also add the pure time. The minimum purity that separates 2 menstrual cycles is 15 days. The average is 23 or 24 days, and it has no maximum. So if the minimum purity is 15 days and the maximum menses is 15 days, then that means potentially a woman could menstruate for half the month and be pure for half the month, and menstruate for half the month and be pure for half the month. Since the minimum of menses is 24 hours and the minimum of purity is 15 days, that means possible a woman could menstruate twice in 1 month. The duration of purity between a menstrual period and a postpartum bleeding could be less than that. Yes. So here, when we say the minimum of purity is 15 days, it's very important that you say what we say here. The minimum of purity between 2 menstrual cycles. Not merely the minimum of purity is 15 days, period. That sentence there is too open. Because you could possibly have a purity between a menses and a postpartum bleeding. So we're talking here, when we say 15 days, we're talking about the purity between a menses and a menses. The duration of purity between a menstrual period and a postpartum bleeding could be less than that. Whether the menstruation preceded the postpartum bleeding or followed it. An example of menstruation preceding postpartum bleeding is if the pregnant woman sees blood and we judge it as menstruation. Yani, if we take the saying that it is menses, because they differed about that. So we're going to say then, this pregnant woman menstruated. Then it stops for 2 days, for example, and then she gives birth. Upon that, the blood that exits after the childbirth would be considered postpartum. So in this case, the passage of 15 days between the postpartum bleeding and the menstruation is not a condition. Not a condition. In this case, this scenario, there was a 2-day period, a 2-day window, a 2-day window of purity between a menstrual bleeding and a postpartum bleeding. And in this scenario, the menses came first. As for menstruation following postpartum bleeding, if menses occurs after the postpartum bleeding reaches its maximum, such as for the woman to see postpartum bleeding for 60 days, then it stops for a day, then blood reappears, then that new blood is menstruation. So then that's a an interval between menses and postpartum that's less than 15 days. Another scenario is if the woman experiences postpartum bleeding for 55 days. Then the blood stops for 6 days. Then the blood recurs. This is also menstruation. You said, so there's no minimum number of purity days between postpartum bleeding and menses. I haven't learned a minimum number for sure. It just doesn't have to be 15 days though. I mean, Wafiq. As for her postpartum bleeding stopping, then she saw new blood before reaching the maximum duration of postpartum bleeding. So, what are we talking about here? A woman has postpartum bleeding. You know, the maximum of postpartum is 60 days. So, what if she had postpartum for 30 days or 40 days? That would mean she still has 30 or 20 days open for postpartum. And then the bleeding stopped. Then, if 15 days or more have separated the two bleedings, if 15 days or more have separated the two bleedings, the second bleeding is menstruation. So what are we saying here? We're saying in this case, she did not max out for her postpartum bleeding. She didn't max out. Her postpartum bleeding stopped, leaving still days that could be accepting of postpartum bleeding. But it's just stopped and it didn't come back. And then 15 days later or more, she saw new bleeding. Then what's that? That's menstrual bleeding. Hence, if the woman experiences postpartum bleeding for 40 days, then the blood stops for 15 days or more. And then it recurs or reoccurs, meaning then new blood came. We consider the new bleeding menstruation. If there were not 15 days separating the two bleedings, what's the first bleeding? The first bleeding is a postpartum bleeding that did not max out. And then there's a new bleeding. So if there were not 15 days separating the two bleedings, rather, there was less than that, we consider the recurring or reoccurring blood still postpartum bleeding because she's still inside the postpartum window. So our menses window is 15 days. Our postpartum window is 60 days. She had postpartum bleeding. It stopped before she maxed out. She's still inside the postpartum window, and bleeding came back before 15 days. Then this is still postpartum bleeding. So if she experienced postpartum bleeding for 40 days, then the blood stops for 10 days. In this case, the postpartum bleeding did not reach its maximum, nor did 15 days separate the two bleedings. So she considers it postpartum bleeding. Yani, she considers it, let's squeeze in here the word, still postpartum bleeding. And review, please. And then it's going to be so clear for you, inshallah, as we continue. Alhamdulillah. Personally, I find this very fascinating subject, though I've never menstruated a day in my life. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.